This is your first time to the educators. Several. This is the brainchild of Dr. Max Michael, who is with us today, who is the Dean of the School of Public Health, and he'll give you a couple of ideas about where things came from, I think, as he speaks today. But we've been open, I will quickly tell you that we've been open, October will be 2 years. We've hosted 1,500 sessions with over 30,000 people through this space in that time. And it ranges anywhere from a group that's been in the back all day today. Some of their members are here working on brain mapping to figure out a better way to deal with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, to the Birmingham Museum of Art meeting here to figure out a better way to hang their artwork more education. And anything you can imagine in between has occurred in the last 2 years here in terms of events going on through this space. But we're designed to capture creativity, innovation, intellectual capacity within the university and do good things within the community. And one of the things that we thought was important was to establish a lecture series. We have 25 faculty members across the university. I won't say that they're eccentric, but they're all unique, have agreed to participate as Edge of Chaos scholars. In doing so, one of the things they've agreed to do is to give a lecture once a year. So if you think about that, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's pretty much a lecture every 2 weeks. I would encourage you, if you enjoy what you hear today, to come back on a regular basis. We will make sure that you're notified, and you can kind of pick and choose the topics that interest you. One of the reasons we asked our guest speaker to start, or I did actually, today is because the conversation that you're going to hear today is something that's unique, it's different, it's a different way to look at things. And that, again, that's exactly what this space is designed to do, is to give you a different way to look at things as we move forward. So with that, Dr. Michael, it's yours.
Well, let me add my welcome to have you here. This space, as David said, is designed to bring ideas and people together and hopefully create new opportunities for people to work together, think together, something beyond just being a space. And with that, I'm actually going to tell a story about Andrew Keitt, who is our speaker. His wife is my dental hygienist. And I was in the chair one day, probably a year or 2 years ago, and she said something about, I've heard about the Edge of Chaos. And I'm sitting over in Vestavia, and I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, my husband heard about this thing called the Edge of Chaos and was really interested. You need to talk to him. So here's a guy that lives way on the other side of campus, does history, witches and stuff like that. And we started having a conversation. The kinds of things that Andrew is interested in, which you will hear about, was real intriguing, and it just brings a different kind of perspective, and in a way it's the whole idea of leveraging the intellectual capacity of the university, with diverse ideas, bringing them together with community people also. We just have no idea what's going to happen. So that's the whole idea of this. So with that, Andrew Keitt, who is a professor in the Department of History, is interested in dialogue mapping, and you're going to tell us about that. And I think this is a free-for-all, so if you don't like what he's saying, you can throw tomatoes. If there's a question you have in the interim, ask him.
Yes.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Max. As Max said, this project is very intertwined with the Edge of Chaos, and so I'm happy about that and happy to be invited to talk about it, and happy to see you all here. As my title suggests, I'm going to talk about mapping and wicked problems and issue-based information systems, but not necessarily in that order. In fact, I'm going to take an autobiographical approach to this because, as I said, this interest of mine developed along with the Edge of Chaos. And so there are a lot of problems, and people want to solve them, which is a good thing. But I'm going to suggest that in a sort of counterintuitive way that we should spend more time when stepping back and thinking about problems and the structure of problems and the nature of problems before diving in, rolling up our sleeves, and trying to solve them. So, what is the problem? I'm going to talk about a problem that is of interest to me and one that I've thought about over the course of many years, having to do with teaching and undergraduate education, something that I've been interested in and wondered about for a long time, and in particular why college teaching doesn't innovate very much. I mean, universities are incredibly innovative in research activities, and but teaching not so much. And it's always been a question that I've had. So how can college teaching become more innovative? This was my question, and as I said, I'm going to kind of lay it out autobiographically, just to illustrate the point. So here I am, this is 1980, and I'm a freshman in college, and I'm reading Nausea, thinking about Jean-Paul Sartre. I don't know why I'm so cheerful. I'm reading about modern man's Sisyphean task of finding meaning in the edge of the abyss of absurdity, but I don't know, I kind of like that stuff. And so, you know, in the 80s, you know, people were still talking about existentialism, right? Because a lot of people that were my teachers were trained in the 40s and 50s when, you know, that was kind of the thing. And I took some history classes as an undergraduate, and they were usually structured, exams at least. You'd have an essay question, big question that you'd spew out a lot of stuff, and then you'd have some short answer identifications. They'd give you a list of terms, and you would give a little sound on that. So, and if you fast forward 10 years, and now I'm still cheerful, but not reading Sartre anymore, first-year graduate student, and now everybody's interested in post-structuralism. Michel Foucault. Now I'm all happy reading about being imprisoned in linguistic structures and trapped within the matrix of power/knowledge and watching it colonize our souls. But again, I kind of like that stuff. But a decade later, now I'm a TA, I'm a teaching assistant, and there's our friend Michel Foucault, but now I'm grading history exams that are comprised of essay questions and short answer identifications. All right, well, fast forward another 10 years, here I am. I'm not so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed anymore. I'm a new faculty member here. Just as an aside, if you go to Google Images and search for stick figure professor, that's the best they've got. I mean, what's up with that? I don't get it, but that's me now, at the beginning of the new millennium, and you notice I'm not really thinking much of anything now, just trying to get tenure. I didn't really have time to think of much else. And now I'm a historian myself, and I'm giving exams, and guess what? They're essays, lists of short answer IDs. So that's 20 years down the pike. And you know, nobody's thinking about existentialism, but I'm still getting the same kinds of exams. Fast forward another 10 years, now I've finally weaned myself off all those French philosopher guys and read some Darwin, and I've gotten interested in the relationships between evolution, cognition, and culture, and now I'm not giving reading Darwin, so I'm not. I just got sick of it. I don't give essay exams and short answer IDs. But I promise, if you go and look at syllabi from historians across the country, there's still a lot of. I mean, it still seems to be the assessment method of choice. So either this is the killer app, this is the one assessment method to rule them all, or we're just kind of not innovating at all. And you can see how. I mean, you couldn't go to a conference as a professional and give a paper saying, oh, I haven't really kept up with literature in the last 30 years, and I'm just, yeah, but you can sort of go into the classroom and use the same kinds of assessment methods. So that was the question then. Why? And that's just my personal take on it, but it's not just my imagination. I mean, over that same period, there have been repeated calls for innovation in undergraduate education, the Boyer Report, Scholarship to Reconsider, 1998, a slew of books decrying sort of lack of imagination in undergraduate education. So that's the problem. So how do you solve it? Well, one way to do it is you set up a Center for Teaching and Learning. And we've thankfully done that at UAB, and I'm very happy about this. I've been involved with it. I've been on the Faculty Advisory Council with the Center for Teaching and Learning, and just as a little plug, team-based learning, great technique for doing group work in classrooms. The inventor of the method is actually coming soon to do a series of workshops here at UAB, so that's just my little plug. But so that's one way that you could address this problem. And the problem is, if this was an effective way of dealing with it, I mean, we've been doing this since 1962. This is the web page for the University of Michigan Center for Teaching and Learning. I think it was, if not the first one in the country, one of the first ones. So if we've had Centers for Teaching and Learning for 50 some odd years, it hasn't made college teaching wildly innovative. And I think the reason for that is that typically Centers for Teaching and Learning are based on best practices regimes. And even in our little blurb here, you can see that what's offered are best practices. So what you do is you find some bad practices and you say, we don't want those practices, here's some best practices. Use these instead. It's rarely very effective, or it doesn't seem to be. And so, I got thinking about this, and as we were setting up this Center for Teaching and Learning, and thinking about best practices, because it's something that you hear a lot, and somehow I guess I was Googling around somewhere and found this book, The Heretic's Guide to Best Practices, and it's a critique of best practices, and sees them as rituals for taming wicked problems. Right? They're basically ritualistic in nature. They try to take very complex problems and tame them, give them at least a facade of manageability. So, what is the problem about innovation in college teaching? Well, according to these guys, the problem is wicked, and best practices are a futile attempt to tame it. And then this led me to a guy named Horst Riddle, who coined the term wicked problem. He was a professor of design and planning. He spent some time at the University of California at Berkeley, and in 1973 wrote this paper in which he coins his term wicked problems. And this has been one of the themes of the Edge of Chaos, thinking about wicked problems. And he came up with a list of criteria for defining wicked problems. Wicked problems cannot be easily defined so that all stakeholders agree on the problem to be solved. This is sort of the essential thing with wicked problems. They're hard to define. People think they understand them. You say, well, how can college teaching become more innovative? Well, just find some innovative things and show people how to do them. But when you really start thinking about it, I mean, there's a lot packed into that. I mean, if you've got, who are the stakeholders? I mean, if you've got a room full of professors and administrators and local business leaders and students, and I'll ask them, well, what's the final end of teaching? What is an educated person? I mean, I think it would be very hard to get easy, clear-cut definition of this. So they're difficult to define. They require complex judgments about the level of abstraction at which to define the problem. Right? I mean, this is very true of any problem dealing with education. Are we dealing with a problem in the zeitgeist? I mean, is it just kids these days? Maybe you just can't educate them. Or is it something that you can just tweak in the classroom? You just got to get teachers to do things differently. Or is it neoliberalism? Or who knows? I mean, where do you even start to decide what level to attack this problem? Wicked problems have no clear stopping rules. And you're never going to say, okay, we've taken care of that, we've got all our kids educated, let's move on to the next problem. Right? And in this sense, wicked problems are different from other kinds of complex problems. Wickedness is not the same as complexity. Putting a man on the moon is incredibly complex, and there are probably some wicked sub-problems in that project. But you know when you've done it, right? When the guy sets foot on the moon, you're done. Wicked problems are not like that. Solutions are not right or wrong, only better or worse. They have no objective measure of success. Now you can try to tame down a wicked problem and just define it as something. So when we get our students, when they have an average score of X, well then we've problem solved. Right? So that's a typical way of trying to tame a wicked problem. You just arbitrarily assign an objective measure and then declare the problem solved. They require iteration. Every attempt to build a solution changes the problem. So, I mean, if you think about No Child Left Behind, right? You institute a reform and suddenly the whole curriculum changes. People start teaching to the test. And I like this one, especially when it comes to problems that deal with education. They often have a strong moral, political, or professional dimension, particularly for failure. Right? I don't think that needs any elaboration. Okay, so what now? The problem is wicked. What are you going to do about it? In the Heretic's Guide for Best Practices, it turns out one of the co-authors of that book was a student of this guy, Jeff Conklin. And so that book led me to this one, and I got interested in what was called dialogue mapping. And this is a way of building shared understanding of wicked problems, because what's so wicked about wicked problems is precisely the lack of clarity, the lack of understanding of these problems. People think they understand, but not so much. And dialogue mapping is a variant of an issue-based information system. Not the bird, it's an issue-based information system. And this was pioneered by Horst Riddle, who I mentioned earlier. And this is a graphic method of mapping out the structure of argumentation in solving a problem. And that was what Horst Riddle, he saw these kinds of problems as basically political, and that you had to take an argumentative approach to them rather than a sort of linear problem-solving approach. And I'm going to just let Jeff Conklin, for about 3 minutes, give you an example, because he does a better job than I can. I don't know if do we have audio? Laura, does this... Well, it doesn't matter either way. I can narrate it just as easily.
I'm wondering if your mic is in.
So basically what he does here is contrast conversational structure with issue structure. And basically, when you go to a typical meeting, you have a series of comments, and everyone takes a turn and adds a comment. And, so these are laid out above the blue line here. So what a dialogue map does is capture the structure of these comments, right? Rather than just putting them in a serial arrangement, they use a series of icons, and there are only 4 in IBIS structure. There are questions, answers, pros, and cons. It's basically just the sort of Socratic method in graphic form. And so I got completely wrapped up in these ideas about dialogue mapping and wicked problems, and I had no idea what the Edge of Chaos was up to, or anything like that. I had given a talk to the Center for Teaching and Learning saying, I think this is a wicked problem, and we should think of it in those terms. And at the end of that presentation, someone said, you know, the Edge of Chaos is interested in wicked problems. I said, are you kidding? I had no idea that anybody else was interested in this topic. So I sat down and I wrote a rambling manifesto laying out all my ideas about wicked problems, and I sent it to Max Michael. Now, I promise you that any of the rest of you in this audience, if you had received an email like this, you would have done a sensible thing. You would have discreetly shunted it into your spam filter, and that would have been the end of it. But not Max Michael. Max was the only person at UAB who would read a rambling manifesto like that and invite you out for coffee, which is what he did. So Max and I went out and had a cup of coffee, and at the end of that conversation, said, you know, I'd like to support you in learning how to dialogue map, get some training. And so that put me on this sort of year-long journey in dialogue mapping, which, as I found out, is a lot more complicated than it seems at first glance. And Jeff Conklin has an outfit called the Cognexus Institute, and they train people in dialogue mapping and dealing with wicked problems. And he put me in touch with Casey Burgess-Yakemovich, who's actually over in Atlanta, who's a colleague of his, and she does the training for them. And the first thing she said to me, she said, oh, you're from UAB, are you affiliated with Edge of Chaos? This is just crazy. Where in the world did these people hear about Edge of Chaos? But she ended up being a wonderful teacher, and she taught me how to use Compendium, which is an open source free software which does this, this mapping along with many other cool features. And I spent about a year working on learning this IBIS structure, and one of the most important things about dialogue mapping is thinking about questions. The question is really the most fundamental level of dialogue mapping. And often in a conversational structure, people will make a comment, they'll have an idea, and the question that they're responding to is only implicit. A good dialogue mapper has to be able to think back to this root question and plug it in. Often questions are compound, or they bring in hidden assumptions, that we could take this original question that I came up with, and this really is not a good root question for a dialogue map. How can we make college teaching more innovative? Right? If you think about it, that's actually smuggling in an assumption. It's really an answer to some other yet to be discerned root question. Because I've already made the assumption that that's the answer. It needs to be more innovative. But that's my assumption. Really, if you were going to map this, you would want to sort of unpack that hidden answer and make that an idea, and then link it up to a more fundamental root question. So it could be something like, what should we do in response to critiques of teaching in higher ed? So then you could, right away, you've got some other kinds of answers you could have that. Sort of foreclosing this, someone could say, well, it's not the problem of teaching at universities, it's just that we get students who aren't prepared. So really what we should do is make sure students are well prepared before they get here. Another plausible one would be nothing. These are not legitimate critiques. They're just piling on. Things are fine at universities. Thinking about questions is the sort of most fundamental aspect of good dialogue mapping. And they come in different varieties, and you have to learn to sort of discern them on the fly. The deontic question, what should we do, right? That root question is really about what should we do. An instrumental question is how should we do it? Criterial questions, what are the criteria for assessing the answers? Meaning questions, factual questions, background questions, stakeholder questions, and questions about the future. These are 8 very common kinds of questions that you see again and again and again in dialogue. And learning to dialogue map well means sort of being able to pick these up on the fly. So, for example, then you could expand the map and you could have a meaning question attached to make college teaching more innovative. Well, everyone loves to talk about innovation, but I mean, what do you really mean by innovative? We could add a con to this idea below, make sure students are well prepared before they get there. Well, we really don't have any direct control over this. So that's the basic structure. Maps are built from left to right. Every idea has to link back to a root question. You can't link a series of ideas together. Ideas can never link up to other ideas. And the reason for that is once you do that, you're back into the sort of conversational serial structure. Right? So you end up with these kinds of branching trees from left to right. And this is one that we did here at the Edge of Chaos. Once I had finally completed this year-long training to sing for my supper, Max invited me to sit down with the Advisory Council for the Edge of Chaos and to do some planning and think about what the Edge of Chaos should be doing, where it should be going from here. And this is a good example of a map, but it also demonstrates something else about this IBIS format and the compendium program that's used to create these maps. Is you can nest maps within maps, and so all of these here are sort of sub-maps. So you can get a huge amount of complexity and sort of manage it in ways that are clarifying rather than overwhelming. Jeff Conklin has done work for NASA, the Department of Defense, and the state of California dealing with global warming initiatives and huge, huge complex projects that have lasted years and years and years. And this program offers a sort of very elegant way of approaching these, but also one that's quite powerful. And so the first sort of real project that I worked on was this strategic planning for the Edge of Chaos, but another place that I've really been interested in trying to implement dialogue mappings in the classroom, and I think that there are a lot of really promising applications for using issue-based information structures in the classroom. I'm going to escape right here and show you the one that I built with my graduate seminar last spring. And you know, when you look at a historiographic debate, this was a course on witchcraft that I did last spring, and we identified 4 root questions, or essential questions that historians have asked about witchcraft, and then we tried to map it out over the course of the semester. Because ideally, historians, in responding to these questions, or providing answer to a larger historiographic question, and then marshaling evidence for and against different positions. So we started with the question about the reality of witchcraft. It's a big question. I mean, were these just delusions and fantasies, or was there some element of something real happening? And so all of the pieces that we read in the first part of the semester were in response to that question. So we mapped them out here. These different historians, Clark, Baver, all had an idea pertaining to this question. And then in the sub-maps, we mapped out the actual readings. And so we would sit in class, and I'd have them come with their sort of homemade maps, and then we would try to come to a consensus about how the different articles approached the question. And we did it for an entire semester, and the map ended up being quite extensive. We got down to, well, for example, another question about witchcraft prosecutions as a method of social control. Some people think that you know, the emergence of the modern state corresponded more or less with the great witchcraft craze, and some people have thought that this was a way of disciplining social deviance, and all of the pieces that we read during this unit laid out very nicely with regard to that question. So again, we would come into class, and we would put the root question up on the screen, and we would hash out over this over a couple of hours this map.
So Andrew,
Yes.
in the previous example, the little green icons that had a plus, are those your pros?
Those are the pros. So they have their color coded. The questions are a blue, ideas or light bulbs, yellow, and then red for con, green for pro. So it's a kind of an intuitive.
So that's where you
set
lay
of-
out the evidence.
Right. In that case, but now in a meeting, you know, these would be you know, supportive comments for a certain idea or a proposed course of action. Yeah, and they're only 4, but you can build up quite extensive maps from just these 4 elements. Yes.
So one thing that is a great approach, but one thing that is notable about it is that there has to be a consensus among the group that's doing this approach. That A, a conversation has to happen, and B, that there aren't any legitimate right lines or rule books. This implies relativism in a sense that sometimes people in this conversation, you may have individuals where relativism, they come from a place where there is no relativism. There are hard lines and fast rules. And so, for example, the absolutists in France, that you have in one of your bubbles there, would throw a rock at your whole premise and say, well, but this is the way things are, and it's nice that you have a conversation, but God has ordained that. You know, so part of this dialogue mapping requires that there's a consensus that a conversation needs to occur.
No, I don't agree. In fact, you don't. You can very productively approach a wicked problem and find that there is no shared understanding. And that's a very good thing to know. What typically happens is you just assume there's a consensus, or that there's a shared understanding. That's what we typically do, and we talk past each other. No, you can you can, by looking at a conversational structure, you can come to the conclusion that there are red lines, that there are, yeah, and you know, with the historiography map, I mean, you know, these are positions and arguments that different historians have made, but you know, and in maps, and one of the most important kinds of questions is factual question. I mean, there are facts, and you can map those as well. But in a way, this is a nice segue actually into this next point, because you know, this is where I should be selling you the snake oil, right? I can say, well, you know, this is the greatest things in sliced bread. If we could just all do this, then it would be a new best practice. I can say, well, we would solve a lot of problems if you would just listen to me and everyone would start dialogue mapping. So, you know, if dialogue mapping is so great, why isn't everybody doing it? That's a legitimate question. So, for one thing, you know, there are no silver bullets, and it's a practice, not a best practice. It's a practice in the sense of like a law practice or a Zen practice or practicing a musical instrument. It's not particularly, it's not a lot of bells and whistles. I mean, it involves sort of patient sense making, and to get good at doing it, and I'm just a neophyte at this. After a year of you know, pretty intensive study of this, I'm really, you can make a distinction between issue mapping, which is creating an issue map, like we did in the graduate seminar, and creating a real dialogue map in real time in contentious, you know, proceedings. And that, you know, someone like Jeff Conklin spent a whole career doing that. So it takes a long time to get good at it, and it's not something that you can sort of just drop in on a problem and you know, watch it solve itself. And again, it might not solve the problem. It might just help you clarify the fact that it's something that's not manageable. So I guess the second reason is that it's hard to convince people that if you've got this problem that's driving you crazy, it's like, okay, let's talk about it. You know? Let's step back. Right? What people want to do is solve the problem. You want to roll up your sleeves and solve the problem. It's very hard to sell this to people that, no, let's talk. So we tend to be too skeptical about the value of talking things through. There's another paradoxical reason that we're not skeptical enough about the value of talking things through. When we do talk, we often are put far too much faith in our ability to understand each other, and the sort of I think there are a lot of cognitive biases that work against us in this regard. This kind of brings me back to my friend Foucault, back in the day when we were thinking about language as being this all-consuming network of meanings, that there was no way outside of it. And you know, I'm less convinced by these kinds of scenarios now. And I think you know, this is a quote from a really great book I recommend it, Mind Chaubert by Merlin Donald. And it says, the quality of thoughts can be improved with language, but thoughts do not start there or end there, nor are they judged there. Words and sentences define and clarify knowledge that resides elsewhere in foundational semantic processes that we share with other primates, and where the motive force for the evolution of language must have originated. It's easy to swim in our symbolic cultural sea without ever noticing this, but our ability to perceive the inadequacies of spoken and written language reveal its deep cognitive root. So it's very hard for us to perceive the inadequacies of spoken and written language. So having another kind of representational tool like IBIS, I think, can be really, really useful. Now, as usual, the poets and novelists say it better than the neuroscientists. So Flaubert just said, language is like a cracked kettle on which we beat out tunes for bears to dance, while all the while we long to move the stars to pee. So, dialogue mapping won't save the world, but I'm still convinced that it's a really useful tool for several reasons. You know, just on a personal note, I mean, I was really a lot of learning to be a dialogue mapper is learning to listen well, and I don't mean this in a kumbaya, touchy-feely sort of way, I mean like really understand what people mean. We often think we understand what people mean, but it's often not the case. And then I'm just a lousy listener to begin with. I'm a professor. That's hold forth, locate, and doing IBIS forces you to kind of check that tendency. And it's fun. You start mapping stuff. I mean, when I start thinking in these terms, and I'll sit in a meeting and I'll map, and what's really interesting is you come up with this pattern a lot. Which it's very rare that you actually see the pro and con nodes, because even in typical interactions we have sort of serial soliloquies. And like I said, I'm probably the worst offender in this regard. But to be able to put a shape to the phenomenon is kind of interesting. And so I think that putting things in another format maybe can help us think better and maybe avoid some collective cognitive biases. I heard something on, I'm not making any great claims for this, but it struck me the other day listening to the radio, and there was a study that they tested people speaking a second language, and they found that a lot of the typical cognitive biases that people exhibit disappear when you're forced to speak a second language. And I thought, that's interesting, because IBIS, and one of the reasons it's a hard sell is it's kind of like speaking a different language, and it slows groups down, and you've got this clunky facilitator saying, wait, so are you saying, is that a pro for the point that Susan just made, or should I, or is that a new root question? So it's a little clunky. But then I thought, in a way, maybe that's the beauty of it. I mean, I wonder if collectively speaking the IBIS language could help us avoid some of these typical cognitive biases that bedevil collaboration. And then, the other thing that I guess has been driven home to me the more I've started to think in these terms, in terms of wicked problems and mapping, is that, often you're meeting with people and you just realize we're not here to solve a problem. This is just ritual. And I don't mean that in a snarky way or a bad way. I mean, institutions need ritual to function, right? I mean, there's lots of reasons to get people together, but it's good to know when you're just there for ritual purposes, not really trying to solve a problem. Of course, the bad thing is if you really do have a problem to solve and you try to throw ritual at it, right? And so, I think being able to make these distinctions are important. So, I just want to, this is actually a blurb for on the back of the dialogue mapping book, but I just like it because it says, in the public policy field in which I work, wicked problems are a way of life. Seemingly endless meetings, floating membership in stakeholder groups, hidden agendas, even for people who think they don't have agendas, repetition without visible progress, and satisfying solutions that result when the efforts run out of time for energy members. And I think you could slash public policy and just put it in higher ed, and it would fit perfect. In fact, I think it's even worse in higher ed. And this phenomenon, Jeff Conklin calls it fragmentation. And you get fragmentation when you get wicked problems and social complexity. So wicked problems plus social complexity equal fragmentation. And I've only taught at one university, so I can't make any comparisons. But this has been a sense of mine for many years that UAB and probably universities in general are incredibly fragmented. And maybe they have to be, but it makes it difficult to solve problems. And often what happens is that you get sort of attempts to tame problems through strategic plans or assessment regimes or what have you that end up never getting a real shared understanding or shared commitment to solving an actual problem. And so they end up being mere rituals when real problem solving is needed. And so finally, I think there's one takeaway. If you have to function in a fragmented environment, it's frustrating, and the tendency is, find someone to blame. So you've got power-hungry administrators, intransigent faculty, and apathetic students, and these are characters, right? Thinking about universities as incubators of wicked problems, in a way, helps you take a step back and think, we're faced with an environment that almost inevitably creates fragmentation, and maybe dialogue mapping could have some positive role in mitigating that. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions?
Sure.
I'll start one out and say that one of the things when we did the dialogue mapping with the advisory board that had helped, we have a 15-member advisory board that meets kind of on an irregular basis, but you never know what part of that 15 will show up. So every time you're starting over again, and one of the things that dialogue mapping I think really helped do was that you could start and say, okay, we've already addressed that.
Right,
Where do we move forward? And I just,
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I wish I had more time to sort of go into the beauties of compendium. I mean, it's a really, this is something that Jeff Conklin has worked to develop. I mean, it's open source. It's people around the world contribute to it, but to be able, I mean, it's very powerful. You can do as search functions. You can tag all of these nodes. So, I mean, in big organizations, they'll get these maps that have thousands and thousands and thousands of submaps and different nodes, but it's a database. It's very manageable, and you can keep a record of the deliberation process. I mean, and not just in one academic department. And we have things that we decided just a couple of years ago, and nobody can remember what the issues were, how we came at the decision. And so, even in a small organization like that, to have a repository of dialogue maps would be really helpful.
Well, I was wondering, as the sort of the first step to encounter this, I know you're talking about in the academic environment, but I was wondering about like social, political uses for it.
Yeah.
Like I'm new here, but I was thinking, as you're speaking, I'm sure if you go in Birmingham, and I'm used to do like resource mapping, like where the bus stops, I work with nurse, or where the grocery stores. But I'm sure here, if you go to parts of Birmingham, you say the police, you're going to have a different image in that person's mind than if you go to another place and you go to police.
Yeah.
And you go to another place with a band, they don't even think of.
Right, and that's the other thing about, I mean, wicked problems, you've got to find who the real stakeholders are. And you can't even start to get any shared understanding if you don't have the right people around the table. And that's, so that's, the stakeholder question.
all right, I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer this one, but you wouldn't say otherwise. But we've been hosting programs with Well, the magazine here, on a series on poverty in Birmingham. And Andrew started dialogue mapping the one on education, and tell them what you told me about what you found.
Well, no, I mean, that, for one thing, that's where that's the serial soliloquy syndrome. I mean, because I looked at the map, and then I thought, again, it's like there are no pros and cons. There was nobody that was actually engaging with an idea, whether it was a good idea or why. But
defending their position, I think, is what you described.
yeah, well, also, yeah, if you get often, I guess that would be another syndrome, sort of the faculty advisory syndrome, all right? Because I'm on the faculty advisories for the Center for Teaching and Learning, and because really, when you're talking about teaching and learning, I mean, the stakeholders are not. I mean, we're a bunch of people who are just picked from our relative units because we're representatives, but we're not stakeholders. So we can sit and talk about, wouldn't this be great? And then around the table also, people actually have to implement this stuff. And they have a very different take on it, right? And so what they end up doing is kind of filibustering, saying, well, we've done this, and look at all those things that we've done, and then everyone else sits there, why can't you do this, why can't you do that? But there's a big difference between a representative and a stakeholder, and you're never going to come to a shared understanding of a problem if you don't have the right people, like you say, and different stakeholders are going to have very different conceptions of what the problem is.
And just as a follow-up, like I said, I've never really heard this. I don't know the research on it. Is there a particular way, like if someone were to train, and then they go again out into society and say, well, we're mapping, and I don't use a red dot and a yellow dot and a green dot. That has an intrinsic dictionary inside this training where it's like, well, now we sort of had an understanding sort of objective, and so we could understand more why these individuals, like I worked with Bank on Birmingham. Mm-hmm. You would have someone who, you ask them, it's to set them up to get them to feel safe about banking. You would have someone say, I don't trust banks. Right. But that same individual has been robbed 3 times. They don't trust banks, but they don't use banks, and they're more vulnerable. Yeah. And you know what I'm saying? Like, is there a dictionary where a person could go, like a census, and say, okay, this is how this person understands this word or this context. and you can sit back and tabulate that and come out with a map, like, you know.
Yeah, I don't know if compendium would be the tool for that, but it's a really interesting idea. You know, the other great thing about shared display is that people, and this is one thing I found really nice in the classroom, is that it's kind of validating. When you get your say, and it goes up there, and then it's recorded. And often that can make classrooms and maybe meetings too smoother. You don't have to repeat yourself and keep hammering a point. It's like, you've been validated. The facilitator said, is this an accurate summary of what you said? It's on the map. We don't have to revisit. And then when we come full circle again, you can point to the map and say, this looks like we're going back to this, you know, the answer to this prior question. Is that right? Should I put that up here? So it's a way of structuring the actual meeting as well. Again, that's something that takes even more practice. I'd love to see Jeff.
If you see us send out an agenda from up here, which we don't have agendas at the Edge of Chaos, it'll look like a dialogue map, as you've seen up here.
I think there was a question.
Andrew, in terms of trying to use it for a community discussion about an issue, like transportation, what I saw in the well conversations was, if I have an opinion, it's my only opinion, and I can only express it the way that I can express it. The way you put it in a dialogue map involves me trusting you.
That's
That's
right.
You have identified the I don't know if objectivity is what I want to say, but the judgment of the mapper in terms of how my thought is expressed in the map. How do you...
Well, that's the importance of validation. One of the most important things in dialogue mapping is validating a comment. I mean, the person who offers a comment has got to
But you ask it that it be either a negative or a positive, a pro or a con, or a yes or a no. What were the other two, pro and con?
Well, there are ideas
Right.
that link up to questions. And then,
But the people at the table have a basic trust issue anyway.
that's exactly right. And I should have put that up against, and the other reason that dialogue mapping is really why it's not saving the world is it can only really be effective in places where there's a holding environment or a real sense of trust among the participants. I mean, you have to be desperate. You got a problem you have to solve so badly that you're like willing to take the plunge, or you really have to trust people enough. And I think in a lot of, people don't want to really hash out ideas and criticize each other in a situation where you don't necessarily trust the people, you don't know what their agendas are, you're not, or if you don't trust the facilitator. So I think that's so important, and it's a real challenge to doing effective dialogue mapping. But you're right, and a bad facilitator, and I would classify myself in that I think at this point, but you have to be able to not impose your map on the group, and people who are really good at it can kind of make the map fit the conversation. But you'd also be surprised how many, those four little icons cover a lot of territory. You can often take a comment, and when you think it through, it's like, this really doesn't seem like it at first, but it really is a comment in support of this idea that was laid out here. But again, it's an art as much as a skill. Yeah.
Two more.
Kind of connected to that question and what was talked about earlier is the idea of you have to come to a consensus. I heard you say I don't think you do have to necessarily all agree, but you have to want to get to a solution, and you have to have the audience that is in the room has to agree. It kind of goes along with that trust. You have to agree that you're going to try to work towards something, because if you have two opposing sides, they're going to try to win, that their voice gets.
You have to have shared understanding before you get shared commitment. You could get shared understanding and not get the shared commitment to solve the problem. The understanding could be that we can't work together, and again, that's not a bad thing to know. But also, when I first got interested in this, I found myself trying to map. I'd sit on meetings and I would just be doing this on the behind the scenes, and again and again I'd find that this is not a group that really is here to solve a problem. Either it's not the real stakeholders, or people don't trust each other enough to really, or it's just not that important. We're meeting because...
Can you make people people shut up?
I would have to start on myself probably before, but, no, I mean, again, often, if people don't feel like they're being heard, I mean, everyone's been in a meeting where someone will not shut up, and they just keep it, often it's because they just don't feel like anybody's listening, and so again, having a shared display can be a way of saying, look, there it is, there's your comment, you've been heard, it's been recognized, so maybe that's a way of avoiding some of those issues.
One more, we're gonna have to wrap it up.
So I think I'm trying to understand the comparisons and contrasts between this and other deliberative dialogue types of tools or decision-making. And ones that I'm familiar with might be, for instance, like from Kettering Foundation,
Mhm.
where you are doing what maybe you reference as more of an issue map. And in those approaches, there is this process of like naming and framing a problem where you do have to make sure that there is shared understanding of how you're defining what the issue is, and then you're kind of coming up with 3 or more possible ways of solving that problem. But once you have that map in place, then the idea is that you go back and again and re-involve all the stakeholders to decide which approach, weighing the pros and cons, seems to be most palatable, and how what would be the action steps. So I see it as being a little more action-oriented. Does this have some further kind of step to that?
Yeah,
How would you
yes.
put that sense?
No, that's a great question. One of the nice things about maps is you can build in action items into the map and watch them and update the map as they get carried out. We did that in the Edge of Chaos map. And to your point about all other methods, I mean, yes, there are plenty of other kinds of mapping techniques and facilitation techniques. One of the things I think is powerful about IBIS and Compendium, the software is very, very powerful, and you can track really, really large projects. It's got really nice functionality, and also, but the IBIS structure is very intuitive and very simple. And the further you get away from that kind of intuitive, questions, ideas, pros and cons, I think it loses some of its force. But again, I'm not familiar enough with these other methods to really compare and
I guess
contrast
my
them.
question, I didn't clearly ask it, was what is the outcome of this meant to be? Is it meant to be sort of like, we're gonna all agree on what, well, I don't know, like where do you stop? When's it over?
Well, yeah, wicked problems have no stopping rule, so that's a good question. I mean, you don't really solve, you manage wicked problems. You don't really solve them. So I guess, IBIS maps, compendium maps can provide a nice resource and sort of archive of decision-making processes. I mean, and again, the idea would be that there would be some sort of action item built into the map, but I don't know where it
Well,
ends.
one of your maps had that list of outreach programs. Would you not classify those as solutions or potential
Well, those were.
things you're going to do?
We had actually. I'd go back to the map, and I'm not even sure where it's on my slides, but there was an actual sub-map with action items that we identified, and there's a format for that in IBIS about identifying people who are actually going to carry out the action and a way to sort of check those off as they're dealt with. I'm not sure if that. I wish I had a better answer.
I guess what you're saying is you don't measure whether they solve the problem or not, or is that?
Well, yeah, you record them. All of those maps that when I went onto the internet, I've got a server where I upload all of these maps so they can be publicly available or available to the groups that are using them. And then they can go in and look at the action items that we established. And when they're done, then I update the map and I note them as done. So you can, they all reside in the same place, the dialogue and the action items.
And then you have another wicked discussion about did they work, right?
Yeah. And that's the thing.
It is,
It's a
it is
practice.
an ongoing
It's a practice.
process, as we're finding at the edge of chaos.